The convoy radio crackled to life at 6:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Highway 1 like a blade through silk. Master Sergeant Dylan Costas adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of the lead HEMTT truck, his knuckles white against the desert-worn leather of his driving gloves. Behind him, 17 supply vehicles stretched across the Iraqi wasteland like mechanical vertebrae, each loaded with MREs, ammunition, and the lifeline materials that kept forward operating bases breathing. Thunder Base, this is Convoy Alpha 77, approximately 15 clicks from Checkpoint Bravo, Dylan transmitted, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Something felt wrong. The sky above was too quiet, too empty. In 3 Tour, he'd learned to read the desert's moods like his daughter's bedtime stories back home in Kentucky. That's when the impossible happened. 2 silver specks materialized against the pale morning horizon, moving with predatory grace that made Dylan's chest tighten. F-22 Raptors. He'd seen enough aircraft during his previous life to recognize the angular death machines instantly, their stealth profiles cutting through air like whispers of apocalypse. But F-22s didn't operate in this theater. They were ghosts, legends, aircraft that lived in classified briefings and Pentagon wet dreams. The lead Raptor banked sharply, its pilot-controlled movements too precise, too purposeful to be routine patrol. Dylan's radio exploded with static, then cleared to reveal a voice that made his blood freeze in his veins. Ground convoy, this is Spectre 11. Break formation immediately and await further instructions. The female voice carried authority that seemed to compress the desert air itself. Dylan's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his radio muscle memory from another lifetime threatening to override his current reality. Because he recognized something in that transmission, not the voice, but the cadence, the professional calm that masked operational intensity. Spectre 11, this is Convoy Alpha 77 Actual. We're a routine supply run, no hostile contact reported. Dylan's response carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on asking the right questions without seeming to question authority. The F-22s dropped altitude, their massive engines creating pressure waves that Dylan could feel in his chest cavity. The lead aircraft's canopy caught morning sunlight, revealing nothing but reflective darkness where a pilot should be visible. Convoy Alpha 77, came the response, and this time Dylan heard something else beneath the professional veneer. Recognition. Impossible recognition. What's your actual call sign, driver? Dylan's throat constricted. Nobody had used his operational call sign in 4 years. Not since he'd hung up his flight suit and picked up a wrench, trading sky for ground, wings for wheels, glory for the steady paycheck that kept his 7-year-old daughter in school clothes and soccer cleats. The desert held its breath, waiting for an answer that would change everything. The lead supply truck felt smaller suddenly, its armored cab pressing against Dylan like a confession booth. His daughter Emma's photograph smiled at him from the dashboard, gap-toothed and innocent, blissfully unaware that Daddy had once been someone else entirely. Someone whose call sign had been spoken in briefing rooms where maps were covered in red ink and mission success rates were measured in acceptable losses. Negative Spectre 11, Dylan replied, his voice carefully modulated. I'm just hauling beans and bullets. The F-22s maintained their aggressive orbit pattern, their wingtips occasionally catching sunlight in ways that reminded Dylan of hunting birds circling wounded prey. Through his side mirror, he watched his convoy drivers shifting nervously in their cabs, hands moving instinctively toward personal weapons that would be utterly useless against fifth-generation fighter aircraft. Cut the shit, ground convoy. The female pilot's voice carried a sharpness that could etch glass. Falcon 7, we know you're down there. Respond. The words hit Dylan like a physical blow. Falcon 7. His throat closed completely, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. 4 years of deliberately mundane existence, soccer practices, parent-teacher conferences, midnight fever vigils, evaporated like morning mist. Falcon 7 had been buried, deliberately and completely, beneath the weight of single fatherhood and deliberately chosen obscurity. His convoy's radio channel erupted with confused chatter. "Thunder Base, what's our status? Anyone else seeing this? Those aren't supposed to be our birds." Dillon's second-in-command, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, tried to establish communication protocols, but the words seemed to bounce off the desert air without effect. Dillon keyed his radio with fingers that remembered muscle memory from another lifetime. "Spectre 1-1, I don't know what intel you're operating on, but you've got the wrong guy. Request permission to continue mission." The lead F-22 executed a maneuver that defied physics, a knife-edge turn that brought its nose to bear directly on Dillon's truck. At this distance, he could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy, anonymous behind dark visor and oxygen mask. The aircraft's weapons systems remained cold, but the implied threat was clear enough to make his pulse hammer against his collar. "Falcon 7, this is Ghost." The female pilot's voice dropped to something approaching intimacy, as if she were speaking directly into his ear rather than across miles of hostile airspace. "We need to talk." "Ghost?" Dillon's hands began trembling uncontrollably. Only 3 people had ever called him Falcon 7, and 2 of them were dead. Buried in Arlington National Cemetery beneath flags and full military honors while he'd stood at graveside in his dress blues, Emma's small hand clutched in his, promising himself that he'd never again put someone he loved through the agony of military uncertainty. The third person who'd known his call sign was supposed to be dead too. Dillon's world tilted sideways as memory crashed over him like a rogue wave. Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra "Ghost" Petrov, the woman who'd saved his life over Syrian airspace. The pilot whose final transmission had been a burst of static followed by enemy surface-to-air missiles painting abstract art across the sky. The woman he'd searched for during 3 sleepless weeks of unauthorized reconnaissance missions until his commanding officer had threatened court-martial. The woman whose funeral he'd attended, whose empty coffin he'd helped carry, whose memory had haunted every decision he'd made since returning stateside. "Impossible," Dillon whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. But the F-22, hanging in the desert air above him, suggested that impossible might be the only truth left. The convoy had ground to a halt, 17 military vehicles scattered across the highway like toys abandoned by a distracted child. Dillon's radio crackled with increasing urgency as his drivers demanded explanations he couldn't provide. Thunder Base was requesting status updates. Higher command was undoubtedly tracking the situation through satellite feeds and drone surveillance, watching 2 unauthorized F-22s hover over a routine supply convoy like digital vultures. Dillon stepped out of his truck, boots hitting asphalt with the finality of a judge's gavel. The morning sun was climbing higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of Emma's hair when she laughed. Above him, the F-22s maintained their perfect formation, twin predators suspended against infinite sky. "Ghost, if that's really you," Dillon called out, knowing his voice transmission would carry to the aircraft's communication systems. "You've got 30 seconds to explain why you're not dead before I call this in as a hostile contact." The lead F-22's engines modulated slightly, a sound Dillon's trained ear recognized as preparation for rapid acceleration. But instead of breaking contact, the aircraft began a slow descent, its landing gear remaining retracted, but its altitude dropping to barely 300 feet above the highway. Close enough that Dillon could see individual panel lines on the fuselage, close enough that the jet wash began stirring dust devils across the desert floor. Falcon 7 were operating under classified parameters. Ghost's voice carried a weight that seemed to compress the air itself. "Your convoy is carrying more than supplies. Check your manifest, Truck 14. Dillon's blood turned to ice water. Truck 14 was Rodriguez's responsibility, sealed cargo that had come with orders not to inspect, not to question, just to deliver. The kind of shipment that came with extra security clearances and deliberately vague paperwork. The kind Dylan had learned to accept without question, because single fathers with custody arrangements couldn't afford to ask inconvenient questions. He walked back to his radio, conscious that every step was being observed through advanced targeting systems capable of tracking individual heartbeats from miles away. Rodriguez, pop your manifest. What's the actual cargo designation for Truck 14? Static filled the channel before his second-in-command's voice returned, tight with confusion. Sir, this doesn't make sense. According to this paperwork, Truck 14 is carrying personnel, but that truck's been sealed since loading. Nobody went in, nobody came out. The F-22s suddenly broke formation, one aircraft climbing rapidly while the other maintained overwatch position. Dylan watched through his binoculars as the ascending Raptor disappeared into the blue, its contrail the only evidence it had ever existed. Ghost's aircraft remained, a silver angel of death painted against the morning sky. Dylan, Ghost's voice carried across the radio waves with unprecedented intimacy, using his first name instead of military designation. Some stories don't end when they're supposed to. Some people don't stay buried when you need them to. Truck 14 is carrying the answers to questions you stopped asking 4 years ago. Dylan's knees nearly buckled, because buried beneath her words was the truth he'd suspected but never dared voice. His transition from combat pilot to supply convoy leader hadn't been his choice. Someone had arranged his transfer, his daughter's school placement, even the apartment lease in Kentucky. Someone had been watching, waiting, keeping him close enough to use but far enough away to maintain deniability. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant storms and the promise of answers that might destroy everything he'd built. His radio crackled one final time. "Open the truck, Falcon. It's time to come home." Rodriguez's hand shook as he approached Truck 14, bolt cutters gleaming in the morning sun like surgical instruments. Dylan stood beside him, acutely aware that Ghost's F-22 maintained perfect overwatch position, her weapon systems undoubtedly trained on the convoy with targeting precision that could separate individual molecules if necessary. The other vehicles had formed a defensive perimeter without being ordered, his driver's military instincts overriding their confusion. The sealed compartment lock snapped under the bolt cutter's pressure with a sound like breaking bones. Rodriguez pulled the heavy door open, revealing darkness that seemed to absorb the desert sunlight. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a figure stepped into the light and Dylan's world collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, his former commanding officer, the man who'd signed his transfer orders, who'd attended Ghost's funeral, who'd looked Dylan in the eye and sworn that she died in Syrian airspace. Webb looked older, grayer, but his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made him legendary in special operations circles. "Hello, Dylan," Webb said, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to rearranging reality to suit operational requirements. "We need to talk." Dylan's sidearm was in his hand before conscious thought engaged, muscle memory, overriding 4 years of deliberately peaceful existence. Around the perimeter, his convoy drivers reacted with similar speed, weapons materializing with practiced efficiency. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, tension crackling through the desert air like electrical discharge. "Stand down, Sergeant Costas," Webb commanded, using Dylan's current rank rather than his former officer designation. "Your daughter is safe. She's at soccer practice, just like every Tuesday morning. Coach Martinez is running passing drills, and she's wearing the blue cleats you bought her last month." The specific details hit Dylan like physical blows. Webb's intelligence was real-time, current, invasive. Someone had been watching Emma, cataloging her routines, her schedule, her life. The protective fury that rose in Dylan's chest threatened to override every survival instinct he'd ever developed. "You son of a bitch," Dylan whispered, his weapon steady despite the rage coursing through his system. "You've been watching her." Webb's expression remained impassive. "We've been protecting her. There's a difference." He gestured toward the sky, where Ghost's F-22 maintained its circling pattern. Alexandra's resurrection created complications. Certain parties became very interested in anyone connected to her previous operations, including former wingmen with young daughters. The radio crackled, Ghost's voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Dylan, lower your weapon. Webb's telling the truth. Emma's safe, but she won't stay that way if we don't move fast." Dylan's training warred with his paternal instincts. His daughter's safety trumped every other consideration, but trusting the people who'd manipulated his life for 4 years felt like stepping into quicksand. The F-22 above them represented overwhelming force, but it also represented the woman who'd once saved his life. The contradiction threatened to tear him apart. "Explain," Dylan said finally, his weapon remaining trained on Webb. "All of it, starting with how Ghost survived a direct SAM hit." Webb smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "That's where things get interesting, son, because the woman in that aircraft isn't exactly the Ghost you remember." The desert held its breath, waiting for revelations that would rewrite everything Dylan thought he knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of coming home. Webb's revelation hung in the desert air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything it touched. Dylan's grip tightened on his sidearm as his mind processed the implications. The woman he'd mourned, whose memory had driven him to abandon everything he'd loved about flying, whose funeral had marked the end of his military career, wasn't exactly the woman circling overhead in an F-22 that shouldn't exist. "Explain, not exactly," Dylan demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death briefings. Around the perimeter, his convoy drivers maintained disciplined silence, but their weapon positions indicated they were prepared for immediate action. Webb glanced skyward, where Ghost's aircraft continued its predatory orbit. Project Black Mirror, deep cover psychological operations designed to create enhanced pilot candidates through controlled trauma and resurrection scenarios. Ghost was the proof of concept. The words hit Dylan like shrapnel, each syllable tearing through his carefully constructed understanding of military honor and operational necessity. "You faked her death." "We enhanced her survival," Webb corrected with clinical precision. "The SAM strike was real, the ejection was real. What happened afterward? That's where things become classified above your current clearance level." Dylan's radio crackled, Ghost's voice carrying across the airwaves with mechanical precision. "Falcon 7, we're running out of time. Hostile contacts approaching from grid reference 7749. Multiple aircraft, unknown configuration. We need to move." Through his binoculars, Dylan scanned the horizon, military training automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes. The desert remained empty, but his experience had taught him that empty didn't mean safe. It meant the enemy was good enough to remain invisible until they chose otherwise. "What hostile contacts?" Dylan transmitted back. "I'm showing clear airspace." "Check your 6, Ghost replied, and there was something in her voice that made his blood freeze. Not fear exactly, but recognition of something approaching that defied conventional understanding. Dylan spun around, scanning the southern horizon with increasing urgency. At first, nothing. Then, barely visible against the morning sky, 5 dark shapes materialized like holes torn in reality itself. They moved with unnatural synchronization, maintaining formation that seemed to bend physics to its will. "What the hell are those?" Rodriguez whispered, lowering his binoculars with hands that shook slightly. Webb's expression hardened into something approaching professional respect. "Those are the reason we faked Ghost's death. The reason we've been keeping you in supply runs instead of active flight status. The reason your daughter needs protection." The approaching aircraft were unlike anything in Dillon's experience. They moved with fluid grace that suggested technology beyond current military capabilities, their surfaces seeming to absorb sunlight rather than reflect it. No engine noise, no contrails, no electromagnetic signatures that his truck's detection equipment could identify. Dillon, Ghost's voice carried urgent intimacy that cut through his confusion like a laser. Remember what you taught me about flying in formation. Trust your wingman, even when you can't understand the mission parameters. The approaching aircraft suddenly accelerated, their formation tightening into attack configuration. Dillon's tactical analysis kicked in automatically. 5 unknown hostiles, superior speed and technology, friendly assets limited to 1 F-22, and a ground convoy armed with small arms. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving. All vehicles, scatter pattern Delta, Dillon commanded, falling back on convoy defense protocols that seemed pathetically inadequate against the approaching threat. Establish communication with Thunder Base, request immediate air support. But even as he spoke, Dillon knew that conventional military response would be useless against enemies who operated outside the normal parameters of warfare. The lead hostile aircraft suddenly stopped in midair, defying every law of physics Dillon understood. It hovered above the highway like a malevolent star, its surface rippling with energy patterns that hurt to look at directly. The other 4 aircraft took flanking positions with mathematical precision, creating a kill box that encompassed the entire convoy. Ghost's F-22 dove from altitude, engaging full afterburner in a display of raw power that sent shockwaves across the desert floor. Her aircraft's weapon systems came online, painting targeting solutions across the sky with deadly efficiency. But as her missiles locked onto the hostile aircraft, Dillon realized something that made his stomach drop. Ghost wasn't trying to destroy the enemy. She was trying to draw their attention away from the convoy. Spectre 1-1, break off, Dillon transmitted desperately. You're outnumbered 5-1. Negative, Falcon 7, Ghost replied, her voice carrying the calm acceptance of someone who'd already calculated the odds and accepted the outcome. Mission parameters require your survival. Take Webb and get to extraction point Zulu. The lead hostile aircraft suddenly moved, accelerating from hover to hypersonic speed in the space between heartbeats. Ghost's F-22 met it head-on in a collision course that painted fire across the morning sky, 2 forces of unimaginable power converging in a display of physics that defied human understanding. Dillon watched his past and future collide in a burst of light that turned the desert white as bone, knowing that some battles could only be won by losing everything that mattered. The explosion painted the sky in shades of impossible color, electromagnetic discharge creating aurora patterns that shouldn't exist at this latitude. Dillon's truck's electrical systems failed simultaneously, dashboard lights dying as the shockwave washed over the convoy like digital tsunami. For 30 seconds, the desert existed in perfect silence, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. When Dillon's vision cleared, Ghost's F-22 was gone. Not destroyed, not crashed, simply absent as if it had never existed. The hostile aircraft had vanished equally completely, leaving behind only the memory of physics violated and the acrid smell of ozone that made his nostrils burn. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in Dillon's ears. What the hell did we just witness? Webb emerged from behind Truck 14, his expression grim but unsurprised. The opening move of a war that started before you were born, son. Ghost bought us time, but not much. We need to reach extraction point Zulu before they realize she's not permanently out of the picture. Dillon's radio crackled back to life as his truck's systems reset themselves, the display showing impossible readings, residual energy signatures that suggested technology decades beyond anything in current military arsenals. Thunder Base, this is Convoy Alpha 77. We just experienced. Contact with unknown aircraft. Request immediate. Negative, Falcon 7. A new voice cut across his transmission, female but not ghost, carrying authority that made Webb straighten instinctively. This is Overwatch. Your convoy is now operating under Protocol 77 Black. Maintain radio silence and proceed to designated coordinates. Webb grabbed Dylan's arm with surprising strength. That's our ride, son. Protocol 77 Black means we're officially ghosts now. No records, no backup, no extraction unless we complete the mission. Dylan shook off Webb's grip, his mind racing through tactical possibilities and paternal obligations in equal measure. I'm not going anywhere until someone explains what just happened to Ghost, and I'm sure as hell not abandoning my convoy for some classified bullshit that. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice made Dylan's blood freeze. Falcon 7, this is Ghost. I'm alive, barely, and running on backup power. The hostile aircraft are regrouping approximately 50 miles south of your position. You have maybe 20 minutes before they return with reinforcements. Ghost's transmission carried background noise that sounded like damaged electronics fighting to maintain coherence, but her voice held the same professional calm that had defined her throughout their previous operations. Injured, perhaps, but functional. Still fighting. Ghost, what's your status? Dylan transmitted, relief and confusion warring in his chest. We saw your aircraft. Ejected at the last second into a prototype stealth pod, Ghost replied, her words slightly slurred as if she were fighting unconsciousness. Currently on the ground approximately 10 clicks north of your position, but my extraction beacon is drawing attention from parties we don't want to meet. Dylan looked at his convoy, 17 vehicles and 32 personnel who'd followed him into this situation without question. Men and women who'd trusted him to bring them home safely to families and futures that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. The weight of command pressed against his shoulders like physical force. Sir, Rodriguez approached carefully, his expression reflecting the confusion Dylan felt. The men are asking questions I can't answer. What are our orders? Dylan studied Webb, seeing calculation and desperation in equal measure. The colonel was operating under pressure that went beyond normal military parameters, suggesting stakes that transcended conventional warfare. The appearance of impossible aircraft and ghosts, survival indicated technology and conspiracies that reached into areas Dylan wasn't cleared to understand. But Emma's school photograph smiled at him from his dashboard, reminding him that some responsibilities trumped military duty. Webb, Dylan said finally, I need guarantees. My daughter's safety, my convoy's extraction, and the truth about what's happening here. All of it, or I walk away and take my chances with normal military channels. Webb's smile held no humor whatsoever. Son, normal military channels stopped existing the moment those aircraft appeared. We're operating in territory where the rule book was classified above presidential level. But I can promise you this. Complete the mission, and Emma grows up in a world where bedtime stories don't include aerial warfare over elementary schools. The desert wind picked up, carrying the promise of storms and the certainty that whatever Dylan decided in the next few minutes would rewrite the trajectory of his life forever. His radio crackled one final time. Dylan, trust the mission. Trust me. Some battles can only be won by people who have already lost everything. Ghost's transmission carried finality that made his decision for him. Dylan's hands moved across his truck's control panel with muscle memory born from years of tactical operations, plotting coordinates and calculating fuel consumption, while his mind processed the impossible situation. The convoy couldn't move fast enough to outrun aircraft that defied physics, but staying in place meant certain death when the hostiles returned with reinforcements. Rodriguez, take vehicles 1 through 8 and proceed to Thunder Base using alternate route Charlie, Dylan commanded, his voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. Report convoy ambush by unknown aircraft. Request full tactical response. Do not mention Webb or any classified cargo." His second-in-command nodded grimly. "And vehicles 9 through 17, sir." "Follow me to hell," Dillon replied, the old military joke carrying deadly seriousness. "We're going hunting." Webb climbed into Dillon's passenger seat without invitation, his expression suggesting he'd expected this outcome. Extraction Point Zulu is 15 miles northwest, rough terrain, no guaranteed vehicle access. Ghost's beacon indicates she's mobile but injured. We collect her, complete extraction, mission accomplished. Dillon engaged his truck's four-wheel drive system and pulled away from the convoy, watching in his mirrors as Rodriguez led half their vehicles toward safety. 8 trucks followed Dillon into unknown territory, their drivers trusting his judgment despite having no understanding of the stakes involved. The desert landscape shifted as they left the highway, rolling dunes and scattered rocks providing concealment but limiting speed. Dillon's GPS showed their position relative to Ghost's last transmission, but the coordinates seemed to shift slightly with each update, suggesting she was either moving or her equipment was malfunctioning. "Tell me about Project Black Mirror," Dillon demanded as they navigated through a particularly treacherous stretch of terrain. "All of it. No classifications, no need-to-know limitations." Webb was silent for several miles before responding. "Enhanced pilot program designed to create operators capable of interfacing with next-generation aircraft systems. The technology requires psychological profiles that border on pathological, complete dedication to mission success, willingness to sacrifice anything for operational parameters, ability to function despite impossible odds." Dillon's truck bounced over a hidden depression, jarring his teeth but not interrupting his concentration. "You created sociopaths." "We created heroes," Webb corrected with clinical precision. "Pilots capable of merging human intuition with machine capability in ways that conventional training couldn't achieve. Ghost was the first successful candidate." "Successful," Dillon repeated flatly. "She was shot down and presumed dead." "She was shot down and achieved resurrection," Webb replied. "The ejection pod contained experimental neural interface technology that formed permanent connections between her consciousness and advanced flight systems. She doesn't just fly the aircraft anymore, Dillon. She becomes the aircraft." The implications hit Dillon like vertigo. The woman he'd known, laughed with, trusted with his life, had been transformed into something beyond human understanding. The ghost who'd saved his convoy wasn't exactly the person who'd disappeared in Syrian airspace 4 years ago. His radio crackled with weak transmission. "Falcon 7, I'm reading your approach vector. Be advised, I've got company incoming from multiple directions. Unknown ground vehicles, possibly hostile." Through his binoculars, Dillon spotted movement on a ridge approximately 2 miles ahead, vehicles kicking up dust trails that suggested aggressive maneuvering rather than routine patrol. His tactical display indicated at least 6 separate contacts, closing on Ghost's position with coordinated precision that spoke of professional military operation. "Ghost, can you identify the approaching contacts?" Dillon transmitted while simultaneously plotting intercept courses that would bring his convoy into optimal firing positions. "Negative visual identification," Ghost replied, her voice carrying strain that suggested her injuries were more serious than she'd admitted. "But their electromagnetic signatures match the aircraft that attacked you. Same technology base, same impossible power sources." Dillon felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. The enemy had ground forces equipped with the same physics-defying technology as their aircraft. His convoy of 8 trucks, armed with conventional weapons and crewed by supply personnel, was about to engage opponents who operated outside the normal parameters of warfare. "All vehicles, combat formation Delta," Dillon commanded, falling back on tactics that seemed pathetically inadequate but represented his only option. Prepare for contact with hostiles of unknown capability. Webb checked his sidearm with professional efficiency. Dylan, there's something else you need to know about Ghost's transformation. The neural interface technology. It's not entirely stable. Extended combat operations can result in permanent psychological integration with aircraft systems. Meaning what exactly? Meaning the woman we're about to rescue might not be entirely human anymore. Dylan's convoy crested a ridge and found themselves overlooking a valley that looked like a battlefield from the future, where the rules of engagement had been rewritten by forces beyond human understanding. The valley stretched below them like an arena designed by gods with a taste for violence, scattered boulders and deep ravines providing natural cover that both sides would exploit mercilessly. Ghost's position was marked by wisps of smoke rising from what appeared to be an emergency shelter constructed from ejection pod components, her location offering commanding views but limited escape routes. The enemy ground vehicles moved with fluid coordination that reminded Dylan of hunting pack behavior. 6 sleek machines that seemed to hover inches above the desert floor while maintaining perfect formation. No wheels, no tracks, no visible propulsion system, just technology that made his teeth ache when he looked at it directly. "Jesus," whispered Corporal Martinez from Truck 12, his voice barely audible over the radio static. "What are those things?" Dylan raised his binoculars, studying the approaching vehicles with professional assessment that fought against rising terror. Each enemy craft appeared to be single-occupant, streamlined for speed and maneuverability, armed with weapon systems that flickered with energy patterns he couldn't identify. Their surfaces rippled with the same light-absorbing technology he'd observed on the aircraft, making accurate targeting nearly impossible. "Ghost, we've got visual on the hostiles," Dylan transmitted while simultaneously positioning his convoy for maximum tactical advantage. 6 contacts, unknown vehicle configuration, approaching your position from southeast quadrant. "Copy, Falcon 7, Ghost replied, her voice carrying new strength that suggested whatever medical systems her equipment contained were beginning to compensate for her injuries. "Be advised, these aren't entirely hostile forces. They're retrieval teams operating under conflicting operational parameters." Webb grabbed Dylan's radio before he could respond. "Ghost, this is Command 7. Explain conflicting parameters." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Dylan to watch the enemy vehicles close to within striking distance of Ghost's position. When her voice returned, it carried mechanical precision that made his skin crawl. "The entities operating these vehicles exist in parallel operational frameworks," Ghost transmitted, her words sounding increasingly less human with each syllable. "Some seek retrieval for continuation of Project Black Mirror protocols. Others seek termination of compromised assets. Current tactical analysis suggests 67% probability of attempted extraction rather than elimination." Dylan exchanged glances with Webb, seeing his own horror reflected in the colonel's expression. Ghost's speech patterns had shifted from military professionalism to something that sounded like artificial intelligence attempting to simulate human communication. Whatever the neural interface technology had done to her, the transformation was accelerating under combat stress. "All vehicles prepare for immediate engagement," Dylan commanded, knowing that hesitation would cost lives. "Target priority is protection of friendly asset. Rules of engagement are weapons free on any hostile action." The lead enemy vehicle suddenly accelerated, closing the final distance to Ghost's position with impossible speed. Dylan watched through his scope as the craft settled to the ground with mechanical precision, its occupant emerging in a fluid motion that suggested either perfect training or inhuman reflexes. The figure approaching Ghost's shelter wore what appeared to be standard military fatigues, but moved with coordination that seemed slightly off, as if human muscle memory had been enhanced by external systems. When it turned toward Dylan's convoy, he could see a face that looked entirely human, except for eyes that reflected light like polished metal. Falcon 7, Ghost's transmission carried urgent warning. The approaching individual is designated Revenant 3. Enhanced human, extensive neural modification. Mission parameters include asset recovery and termination authorization. Recommend immediate tactical engagement. Dylan's finger found his rifle's trigger as he realized they weren't just fighting advanced technology. They were fighting against people who'd undergone the same transformation process as Ghost, soldiers who'd been enhanced beyond human limitation for purposes he was only beginning to understand. The war between human and post-human had just become personal, and Dylan's daughter's bedtime stories would never include the truth about what Daddy had to become to keep her safe. Revenant 3 moved across the desert terrain with predatory grace, each step calculated for maximum efficiency while maintaining perfect situational awareness. Dylan tracked the figure through his rifle scope, noting movement patterns that suggested enhanced reflexes and tactical processing capability beyond normal human parameters. The other enemy vehicles had formed a perimeter around Ghost's position, their occupants emerging with synchronized precision that spoke of shared consciousness or advanced communication systems. "Webb," Dylan whispered without taking his eye from the scope, "how many people did you transform like Ghost?" "Officially, 3 successful candidates," Webb replied, his voice tight with something approaching regret. "Unofficially, the program expanded beyond my oversight approximately 18 months ago. Current estimates suggest dozens of enhanced individuals operating under various command structures." Dylan felt cold certainty settle in his chest. The enemy wasn't foreign military or terrorist organization. They were American soldiers who'd been enhanced by the same technology that had transformed Ghost, operating under command structures that had gone rogue or been compromised by forces beyond conventional military understanding. "Ghost, can you identify the other revenants?" Dylan transmitted while simultaneously directing his convoy into optimal firing positions through hand signals. "Confirmed identification of Revenant 3 through 7, Ghost replied, her voice carrying mechanical precision that made Dylan's teeth ache. "Former colleagues from initial Black Mirror protocols. Current operational parameters suggest they've been tasked with either recovering or terminating my enhanced capabilities." Through his binoculars, Dylan watched Revenant 3 approach Ghost's shelter with weapons lowered but ready, body language suggesting negotiation rather than immediate combat. The conversation that followed was inaudible at this distance, but Ghost's posture indicated she was listening to proposals she found either tempting or terrifying. "This is wrong," Martinez whispered over the radio. "We're watching Americans fight Americans with technology that shouldn't exist." Dylan keyed his radio for convoy-wide transmission. "Listen carefully. We're not fighting Americans anymore. We're fighting whatever Americans become when they're enhanced beyond human limitations. Engagement protocols remain weapons-free, but target identification requires visual confirmation of hostile intent." The conversation between Ghost and Revenant 3 suddenly shifted, Ghost's body language becoming defensive as the enhanced soldier's demeanor turned aggressive. Other Revenants began closing their perimeter, weapons systems charging with energy signatures that made Dylan's truck's electromagnetic sensors scream warnings. "Falcon 7, Ghost transmitted urgently, negotiation parameters have failed. Revenants are operating under termination protocols. Recommend immediate tactical intervention." Dylan didn't hesitate. "All vehicles engage designated targets. Protect friendly asset at all costs." The valley erupted in violence that redefined Dylan's understanding of modern warfare. His convoy's conventional weapons engaged targets that moved with inhuman speed and coordination. Muzzle flashes, painting abstract art across the desert landscape, while energy weapons replied with pulses of light that turned sand into glass wherever they struck. Revenant 3 spun toward Dylan's position with reflexes that defied human possibility, returning fire with a weapon that fired concentrated energy rather than kinetic projectiles. The blast struck the boulder Dylan was using for cover, vaporizing stone and sending superheated fragments whistling through the air like deadly confetti. Jesus Christ! Rodriguez's voice carried across the radio frequencies, panic barely controlled. Their weapons are melting our cover. Dylan rolled to a new position, muscle memory from countless combat operations guiding him, while his mind processed the tactical impossibility of fighting enhanced humans, equipped with energy weapons. His rifle felt pathetically inadequate against opponents who moved faster than human reflexes should allow and fired weapons that turned matter into energy. Ghost suddenly emerged from her shelter, and Dylan's breath caught in his throat.